In 1842, the British forced the Chinese to open up 5 trading ports and allow the sale of opium. Other nations then followed suit and forced the Chinese to allow them to trade as well, and previously small towns became huge trading centres. Notably, Hong Kong and Shanghai thrived because of being opened up, and companies like Jardine Matheson grew incredibly wealthy off the opium trade. Plus, this is also the period in which HSBC, or the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation, was founded. Otherwise, Christianity started to make ground within China, and one early convert was Hong Zhichuang. After failing in the imperial examinations, he began to preach that he was the brother of Jesus, and in 1850 he launched the Taiping Rebellion, one of the most deadly wars in human history. But to state that it was merely born out of Hong's belief that he was the brother of Jesus would be a bit naive. Like I stated in the past episode, there were many problems facing the Qing dynasty. They had lost a great deal of money due to corruption, and their population had grown at a near unbearable rate, going from 100 million at the beginning of the 18th century to over 400 million in this period. Plus, like in the past, famines had once again played their part, and in the 1840s there were 2 major ones. In fact, famines in the early 19th century were reported to have killed over 40 million people. So, of course, the social order began to break down, especially further away from the coast, and many were hungry and angry with the lack of government response. Plus, Hong himself was an ethnic Hakka, which is a subdivision of the Han, and he gained a sizable following amongst his fellow Hakkas around Guangxi. As for the other ethnic groups in China at this time, I gave a brief rundown on them in the past video, so maybe go have a look at that. But this region in the south was filled with various ethnic groups like Cantonese and Zhuang, and there were always tensions between these communities. For instance, in 1831, there was a small Yao-led rebellion. Then there were also the secret societies like the Tiandihui, who looked to bring back the old ethnically Han Ming dynasty. But some also believed that there was a great cosmic shift coming, or in other words, the end of the world was nigh. This, which is called Millenarianism, also encouraged many secret societies to launch further rebellions. So you had famines, ethnic tensions and banditry, and Hong adapted Christianity to fit Chinese sensibilities. And then the rebellion broke out. But shortly after the Xiangfeng Emperor came to power, the Yellow River flooded in 1851, once again drawing many angry Chinese people to join the Taiping Rebellion. So Hong was able to take Nanjing and set up the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a Christian state in the heart of China, which almost overthrew the Qing dynasty. And to make things worse for the Qing, not only was he massacring Manchus, but people around the country followed suit and also launched their own rebellions. For instance, bandits in the north, with no great purpose except stealing from the rich and aiding the poor, launched the Nian Rebellion in 1851. Their leader Zhang Lixing even claimed the mandate of heaven when they were on the advance, despite just previously being a salt smuggler. These rebels captured most of Shandong and southern Hebei, and caused a great deal of devastation for over 15 years. Then the Tiandihui came back into the picture, and a group closely connected to them, the Small Sword Society, captured Shanghai in 1851. Meanwhile, the Tiandihui in Guangdong started the Red Turban Rebellion in 1854. Although this was suppressed a couple years later, it caused ethnic clashes between the Hakka, who helped the imperial forces, and the Cantonese. In the end, this ethnic clan war, which lasted for around 10 years, killed close to 1 million people. Plus, to make matters a lot worse, there was an outbreak of plague, and this, the third plague pandemic, was quickly spread by refugees fleeing internal conflicts, and the horrors encouraged others to take up arms against the government. One region struck particularly badly was Yunnan, as there, in 1856, the Muslim Hui people rose up after Han Chinese massacred some of them. This began the Panthay Rebellion, which again lasted for years, this one until 1873, and claimed the lives of over 1 million people. Plus, later on, another Muslim rebellion, the Dungan Revolt, would break out in the far west. Otherwise, the ethnic Zhuang, led by Da Cheng in 1855, took over sections of Guangxi for around 10 years. Plus, the ethnic Mao took over sections of Guizhou for nearly 20 years. And in the midst of all of these rebellions, the Nepalese invaded Tibet in 1855, but this resulted in a stalemate. So most of China was up in arms at this point, and then in 1856, the Chinese in Canton seized a ship known as the Arrow. As this ship was registered with British authorities, the Second Opium War erupted. The French joined the British, and so too did the Americans to a limited extent, and once again the Chinese were easily beaten. The Westerners in fact burnt down the Summer Palace and forced the Chinese to sign another humiliating treaty, which included the expansion of Hong Kong and the payment of war reparations. Plus, as a bit of a side note, the man who ordered the destruction of the Summer Palace was James Bruce, the Earl of Elgin. His father, the previous Earl of Elgin, infamously transported the Greek Parthenon marbles back to Britain, so this father and son team caused quite a bit of cultural damage and hostility against the British for a very long time. However, the main benefactor of the Second Opium War was the Russians. They had already gained the right to trade in cities in western China, but now took the opportunity to begin moving troops into Outer Manchuria. Then, threatening war on a second front, they forced the Qing dynasty to cede half of their ancestral homeland by 1860, allowing them to build the port of Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. Plus, the borders in the west were redrawn, with Russia taking the area around Lake Zhejiang, and the Russians would continue south through Central Asia, taking a lot of former Chinese tribute states away from Chinese influence. Shortly after this, the Xiangfen Emperor died, and he left 8 regions to aid his young son, the Tongji Emperor, in dealing with the ongoing rebellions. But the former emperor had 2 Empress Dowagers, Cixi and Xian, and they united with his half-brother Prince Gong and launched a palace coup. This Xinyo coup not only put the Empress Dowager Cixi in a position of power which would keep for the following decades, but through Prince Gong, China began to look to make some serious reforms. One of the first actions of this self-strengthening movement was the formation of modern armies. Although they had just been defeated by the British and French, they hired some Europeans to help train and modernize their army and navy. These included Frederick Townsend Ward, Leon Zverny, and Charles George Gordon. Gordon, by the way, would later gain fame in Sudan, where he was killed by Mahdists when defending Khartoum. The first of these armies were the ever-victorious army, the Xiang army, and the Peking Field Force. All of these included tens of thousands of men armed with Russian and French weapons, while being trained by the British. The ever-victorious army, however, didn't last very long, as Gordon's strict discipline led to many soldiers deserting. The Xiang army would also later disband, but the Huai army emerged in its place, and it survived until the end of the century. Also, with foreign help, the Qing dynasty also set up the first modern shipyards in places like Jiangnan. So these reforms to the military during the self-strengthening movement succeeded in quelling the rebellions. But by now, after so many rebellions, the central government had essentially lost control over many of their provinces. And with this loss of control, banditry increased not only in China, but also in other nations as rebels fled the country. Many of these bandits and refugees fled to Vietnam and Laos, where they established their own armies like the Black Flag Army, captured land, and took over trade in the area. The Siamese led a number of unsuccessful campaigns against these Chinese bandits during the Hoa Wars, while in Vietnam, they would actually come across the French. This is because the French had just taken over the south of Vietnam, but I'll get to this clash between Chinese bandits and the French in a little bit. Back in China, this self-strengthening movement occurred around the same time as the Meiji Restoration in Japan, but of course, both had very different results. The Japanese became a colonial power within just a few decades, whereas the Chinese continued to decline, and there's a few reasons as to why this was. Japanese modernization was greatly accelerated thanks to the Zaibatsu, 4 huge companies, Sumitomo, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Yasuda. A couple of these existed before the Meiji Restoration, showing that Japan did have the infrastructure in place to adopt capitalist reforms. Plus, they also had an early form of stock market in the Kyoto rice brokers. This, the Qing dynasty completely lacked. Plus, during the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the emperor's forces ousted the ruling shogun and his samurai allies. This removed the conservatives from power within the court and paved the way for reforms without any major opposition. In China, however, modernization came from the ruling emperor and only sought to maintain the status quo. So the few reforms that were done somewhat reluctantly and disingenuously. For instance, sweeping economic reforms that would upset the status quo was met with a great deal of opposition. Plus, the 8-banner system, which I talked about in the past episode, was still influential, so a nationalized and modern army was again met with a lot of opposition. Furthermore, the new shipyards did produce a number of warships and were close to turning China into a regional maritime power, but they couldn't reorganize the structure of the navy, so the Beiyang, Nanyang, Guangdong, and Fujian shipyards all controlled the ships that they produced. This meant that during future wars, they essentially operated as 4 separate navies, rather than one very powerful navy. This was tested in the 1870s in Taiwan, but I think a little background on Taiwan is in order. Taiwan, otherwise known as Formosa in that time, had a large Aboriginal population, and in the 1860s they attacked American sailors. The Americans responded by launching the Formosa Expedition of 1867 against the attackers, but this had little in the way of real success. These Aboriginals then, in 1871, attacked sailors from Ryukyu, which was formerly independent, but coming under further Japanese influence. The Japanese demanded compensation on their behalf, but the Chinese argued that the Aboriginals were wild and outside their jurisdiction. So the Japanese launched their own expedition in 1874. The Japanese were then free to occupy sections of Qing territory, proving the fundamental weakness of the empire. Seeing this, the Japanese went ahead and just annexed Ryukyu a few years later, despite protests from the Chinese. And in the minds of the Japanese, it opened up the possibility of further expansion and colonization in the region. Plus, over in Korea, with Chinese power on the decline, they had lost their main protector. The Americans and French tried to open up the country in the 1860s, but despite a great loss of life, the Koreans refused to yield and open up. But they also still refused to acknowledge the leader of Japan as an emperor. So the Japanese, who were modernizing at a rapid pace, sent a ship to explore Korean waters, and it was fired upon. This resulted in the Ganghwa Island incident of 1875, and the Koreans finally opened up. Some in Korea favoured modernizing in line with the Japanese, yet the prevailing attitude was to still keep aligned with the Chinese. So Chinese soldiers were invited to remain in the country to train the new army and prevent falling under Japanese influence. Yet the structural problems that existed in the Chinese Navy also existed in the Chinese army. Rather than being under a central command, the new armies were under the control of various high-ranking officials. For instance, in the case of the Huai army, it was under the control of Li Hongjiang. So once again, in future wars, they would often not unite to work together, and later on, the commanders would become warlords, and in next to no time, take over huge sections of the country in the early 20th century. Although Prince Gong lost favour in court after being accused of monopolising state powers, Li Hongjiang would continue to push for reforms. Plus, another reformer was Zhou Dong Tang. He helped establish the Fuzhou arsenal. Plus, he also led the expeditions west to crush the Dungan rebels and their leader Yaqub Beg. But Zhou strove to bring the west back under China's control, and won the debate against Li Hongjiang, who argued it was a useless territory. Zhou, by the way, is where General Cho's chicken got its name. The Muslim rebels out in the west had established their own state, named Yetaja, and for a time they were recognized as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, but largely only in name. However, Zhou's expeditions were successful and Yaqub Beg committed suicide, bringing Western China back into the fold. Now, during this rebellion, it's hard to estimate the number of people who were killed, but it could be as high as 20 million. A lot of these died due to famines caused by the war, but there were of course many massacres. Elsewhere, Shaanxi may have lost around 50% of their population, while Gansu lost closer to 75%. But despite all of this loss, China survived. The emperor at this time was Gangxu, but he took over in 1875 at just 4 years old. So real power was split between the likes of Li, Zhuo, and Empress Dowager Cixi and Xian. But Xian would die in the early 1880s, leaving Cixi with more power. Plus, around this time, Zhou advocated for a war with the Russians. They were, after all, in the midst of the Great Game with the British and had been expanding into Central Asia. So when Yaqub Beg had rebelled and pushed east, the Russians occupied parts of Ili. The moderates at court sent Zheng Ho to deal with the Russians and negotiate their peaceful withdrawal. But as Zheng Ho didn't know the geography of the area at all, he essentially handed the territory over to them in 1879. On his return, he was imprisoned as a traitor, and Zhou sent troops to the border, while Russian warships appeared off the coast. War was only avoided thanks to the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg, but this, the Ili crisis, shows that the Qing dynasty wasn't in a permanent state of weakness in the 19th century. They stood up to the Russians, and during 1880, over 200,000 rifles as well as artillery was shipped to China from Europe, and it became apparent there would not be a pushover on land at least. The Russians agreed to hand over territory because they were facing their own political upheaval and debt after their war with Turkey. But this whole crisis brought about mixed feelings in the West. Some British aided the Chinese during the crisis, and believed an alliance with China would aid them against their Russian rivals. But others, in particular the Australians and Germans, began to fear the Yellow Peril. For instance, in Australia, a great deal of invasion literature was written in the following years. The Chinese public also became increasingly suspicious of the Westerners as well, especially because the Christians began to challenge their cultural practices. For instance, at this time many Chinese still practiced foot binding, which the Westerners spoke out against. Plus the widespread poverty caused by the rebellions, floods and the likes meant many parents were turning to infanticide. Many Westerners spoke of how Chinese parents would drown their young girls in particular, but you could also find many abandoned children by the side of the road or left in towers that were built specifically for that purpose. Some estimated that up to a third of all girls born in some region were killed shortly after birth. So the French missionaries set up the Association of the Holy Childhood to take in, baptize, and teach the abandoned children. This practice of infanticide would become a lot worse during the 1870s when a famine struck northern China. During this famine, it is estimated that around 10 million people died and conditions became desperate. There were also reports of husbands selling their wives, mass infanticide, and the likes. But as missionaries worked with the poor, rumours of them buying children and killing them began to circulate. So back in 1870, locals in Tientsin gathered and massacred 60 missionaries, priests, nuns, and converts. This wasn't the first anti-missionary riot. For instance, 2 years earlier in Yangzhou, similar rumours spread, claiming that British missionaries were making medicine out of the babies, and a riot broke out, spurred on by the local aristocracy. These rumours and anti-missionary riots would continue to grow over the decades and become more important. Eventually, in the late 19th century, anti-missionary activity would form the basis of the near partitioning of China, and later the Boxer Rebellion. Plus, the French in Asia had used the killing of their missionaries to invade southern Vietnam just years earlier. But the Chinese agreed to pay compensation and arrest the leaders of the riots, preventing any European intervention at this moment. Yet in Vietnam, the French continued to expand. In 1881, after a dispute between businessmen, the French captured the citadel in Hanoi and threatened to annex the entire nation. So the Vietnamese Emperor Tu Duc called on the Chinese bandits, the Black Flag Army, for assistance. China also sent troops south, and the French feared a large-scale war, so both agreed to split the country in two spheres of influence. But in 1883, Jules Ferry became Prime Minister of France, and after humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War, he hoped to rebuild his country through colonies. An expeditionary corps was sent to Asia to defeat the Black Flag Army and march against the Chinese, who still remained in Vietnam. The Chinese Guangxi army fled from the French at Bac Ninh, greatly embarrassing the Dowager Cixi and those who called for war against the French. But more than just their cowardice, there was another problem in the disjointed armies, as the Yunnan army did not come to the aid of the Guangxi army, so the commanders of both armies were either executed or committed suicide. So war supporters like Zhang Zhidong had to step aside, and Li Hongjiang and his moderates made peace, agreeing to withdraw from Vietnam in 1884. Yet no date for withdrawal was set, and when the advancing French encountered the Chinese, they were ambushed, starting the Sino-French War. Along the border, the French really lacked the men to invade China, and their attacks were driven back. But at sea, the French were more successful. This is largely because the lack of central command hampered the Chinese war efforts. The French were free to sail and destroy dockyards in Fuzhou and the Fujian fleet. The other fleets, meanwhile, were reluctant to get involved and did little to help. The Guangdong fleet, for instance, made no attempts to break through the blockade, the Nanyang fleet split to protect their own cities, and the Beiyang fleet argued that the Japanese or Russians would exploit the situation, so the Fujian fleet was left alone and was nearly destroyed. Plus, the French moved to take Taiwan, blockaded rice shipments in the Yangtze River, and tried to secure an alliance with Japan. So the war could well have been completely disastrous for the Chinese, but false reports of a huge Chinese counterattack led to a political crisis in France and an early peace. Plus, as the Chinese removed their soldiers from Korea to fight the French, the Japanese aided Korean reformers in launching a coup. Chinese troops under Yuan Shikai were sent to restore order, but an all-out war wasn't desired by either side. So Li Hongshan once again looked to make peace. The Treaty of Tientsin was signed, and both Japan and China agreed to withdraw their troops from the country. However, in the court of China, Empress Dowager Cixi began to take over more control. In 1885, she downgraded Prince Gong to just an advisor, and filled the Grand Council with easily manipulated people like Prince Chun. The Guangzhou Emperor would eventually come of age and take full power a few years later, but he made his first serious mistake in slowing down the growth of the navy. CC had done a lot to try and modernise the navy in particular, yet by 1889 this came to a standstill. Otherwise, for the most part, rebellions had subsided and there were no large-scale famines. But a peasants' rebellion in Korea changed all that. This rebellion, the Donghak Rebellion, began as a result of high taxes and unpaid soldiers. The Chinese sent troops to help subdue it, but the Japanese argued that this was breaking their past treaties. Yet tensions had been escalating for some time, and Japan was already looking to expand. The German staff who had been employed to train the Chinese troops predicted that the Japanese would be crushed by the might of the Chinese, yet this was not to be. This is because the pace of modernization in China had been slow, and only around 40% of soldiers in their army carried rifles. The rest of them brought things like old muskets, spears, swords, and even pikes into battle. Plus, there was very little in the way that could be described as modern tactics, and opium was also a particular problem in the ranks. To further exemplify this, there were allegedly soldiers who dressed as tigers while trying to intimidate the enemy with their ferocity. But the wife of a Western merchant, Mrs. Little, didn't believe that they existed at all. She said, "I was told that the tigers were not really soldiers at all, but that some officers drew pay for them as if they existed. And then when the general came to inspect, all the beggars and riffraff of the city put on the tiger uniform over their rags. Turned out in so disorderly a condition that even the officers were afraid of them." So here, either way, you can see a great problem with China. Either this shows you that corruption was incredibly rife and they had no real armies to speak of, or they were still using a ludicrously outdated military unit. Plus, previously, to limit the number of people immigrating to Manchuria, railway lines were not constructed. This severely limited the amount of supplies that could be sent to Korea by land. So, as the Japanese began sending troops to fight the Chinese in Korea, they had to supply their own troops by sea, but the Japanese navy defeated them at Pungdo. A greater defeat came at Yalu River, where the Beiyang fleet met a relatively equal Japanese fleet, but due to poor planning, lack of communication and the likes, they were crushed. Their German ships were taken by the Japanese, and for the next half a century or more, Japan gained dominance of the sea in Asia, and China's decades of modernization were completely undone. Japan was then free to march into Manchuria, while they took Dalian, Weihai and Taiwan. Meanwhile, further Muslim rebellions in the west broke out, and the Chinese had to create a new army to deal with that, the Kansu Braves. They were successful, yet some of their commanders belonged to the Ma family, and they would become powerful warlords in later decades, who controlled the west of China in the early 20th century. So China was forced to make peace with the Japanese in 1895, and the Japanese were given control of Dalian and Taiwan. Yet the locals in Taiwan were unwilling to see the island fall into Japanese hands, so declared themselves to be a republic. The new president of Taiwan, Tang Jingsong, persuaded the leader of the Black Flag Bandit Army, Liu Yongfu, to serve in his army and resist the Japanese. But this was unsuccessful and the republic fell. Otherwise, Korea was now firmly under Japanese influence and would be later annexed by them. But the Japanese were unsuccessful in actually taking Dalian because of the Western powers, specifically the Russians. They wanted a warm water port in the east for themselves and feared Japanese encroachment. Meanwhile, the German Kaiser Wilhelm feared any sort of Asian power, and is credited with coining the term Yellow Peril. So he united with the Russians, and the Russians united with their French allies, and together they pressured the Japanese into renouncing their claim on Dalian. As for the Chinese, they were severely humiliated. Japan had been seen as a lesser state for centuries, but now they had crushed them in a war, taken land and massacred many of their people. And after that war there was a bit of a mad rush for concessions, and China seemed poised to be divided up like Africa was. However, for now you can see that after the Opium Wars, the Chinese weren't necessarily doomed to suffer from a century of humiliation, as it's been called by later historians. They were able to threaten the Russians on land and hold back the French during the Sino-French War, and at some points people even suspected that they would become the dominant power in Asia and not the Japanese, and it's not very hard to see why. They of course had the larger population and had created a larger navy. But institutional problems always meant they were on the losing end of wars, and as we entered the 20th century, anti-foreign sentiment led to further rebellions, lack of reforms led to further dissent, and a lack of central command led to the warlord period. But we'll look at the scramble for China, the dissolution of the Qing dynasty, and the warlord period in the next episode.